Welcome to the Either Or podcast, a podcast where we talk about historical figures in philosophy and contemporary philosophical problems. I'm your host Aidan Clark with my co-host Helen Lang, and today we're talking about artificial intelligence. The best place to start with AI is trying to get at what minimally is the argument for its most general existence. In other words, what do we sort of see nature of reality? Is it more like a biological system, or is it more like a mathematical theory? And I think all of these hinge in a way upon the question of structure, which is a difficult thing to define already. Structure as organic structure, again, structure as mathematical structure. Structure is this kind of substrate that is sort of hidden beneath things and has these patterns and geometries, and it's the sort of the inner source that we're trying to capture when we want to break down a system so as to understand it. Of course, when you get into perhaps sort of the purest study of structure, which is mathematics, which is not just a study of structures that exist in the world, but structures of such abstraction that it would be better to say that what they do is a mathematician studies the sort of pure possibility of structure, sort of pure abstraction, almost as if you had all the rules for the various combinations, abstract combinations of sort of structures that really exist. Mathematics would study those. And as a result, and not sort of incidentally, mathematics comes upon a bunch of paradoxes, reflexive paradoxes, to do with the fact that, well, if we have the rules on one side and we have reality on the other, to what extent is mathematics a kind of total and perfect viewpoint of what's going on in reality? And there was a mathematician in the second half of the 20th century named Alexander Grothendieck, who was a sort of Russian-born French mathematician, who would use this word viewpoint in order to try and describe what is it that, say, mathematics as structure does. And in a sense, he wanted to try and solve this paradox of a description of reality alongside of reality, right? So are they both structured in the same way? Is one a mirror of the other? Is one a representation of the other? Well, the word he used was viewpoint. So in a sense, a piece of mathematics, a theory of mathematics, is a viewpoint. Obviously, this led him down the rabbit hole of saying, okay, well, what's the ultimate viewpoint? What's the absolute viewpoint? And the problem with this is that it introduces a paradox. Because you would think one, maybe very intuitively, well, wouldn't one viewpoint necessarily implicate or discount another? So how can you possibly have a total viewpoint that doesn't involve the destruction of all other viewpoints, and in a sense, by extension, the concept of viewpoints? Where is this viewpoint from nowhere, in other words? And some people have argued sort of against this tide of thinking, which Grothendieck doesn't necessarily see as a possibility, but in a way as an invitation for a relationship to structure and mathematical information that isn't actually based upon finding a total piece of information, nor is it one based upon finding relative pieces of information, sort of, say, epistemically limited pieces of information, such as we might characterize in the context of pluralized viewpoints. But those who reacted negatively even to the basic argumentation, even looking for the holy grail of some absolute viewpoint, would be kind of any of those in analytic philosophy and logic, even in parts of mathematics, who say, well, you're overthinking the problem, because you can have viewpoints naturally inscribed into systems. You can have levels that are not necessarily problematic, and we can basically make distinctions between these levels unproblematically without introducing a total viewpoint or a viewpoint from nowhere. And there are many different names for this, but probably one of the best concrete examples of this comes from analytic philosophy, but also from metaphysics of the last 2,000-3,000 years, which is this concept that, well, everything has some form of self-identity. In other words, there is a kind of metaphysical structure and or substrate to reality, and one of its principal axioms is that things are kind of identical with themselves. This is a basis on which we can develop first logical and later mathematical information. And these kinds of structures are sort of inscribed into things. We don't necessarily have to come up with a total viewpoint. We just have to sort of unravel the relationship, for instance, between logic and metaphysics. The obvious problem with this view is that it introduces metaphysics. You suddenly, in order to explain reality in what is considered a simple way, you have to introduce an entire other reality. So this doesn't necessarily seem to solve the problem. And it gets at this question of how should we imagine, in a sense, what Grothendieck was getting at with what we can maybe describe as a kind of prostration, immersing yourself in reality. And he had a very good description, a kind of metaphorical story he used to tell about a nut, a chestnut that one could put into water. And if one could imagine that hard a nut was like a mathematical problem, the idea was that one would, as opposed to simply cracking it open with a hammer and chisel through specific points, the metaphor being specific technical understandings of the problem, seeing how far they go, if they don't work, trying another one, trying to break the nut open through specific interventions. Grothendieck's solution was, no, just put the nut in water, don't look at it for 6 months, and then when you get there, the shell of the nut basically dissolves, and you have a kind of what's called a, quote, non-trivial theorem. But the interesting insight of the metaphor is obviously, well, what probably more seems to happen is the problem itself dissolves, disappears. In other words, you get such a giant sense of all the information around the single problem you were solving. This is the water. You sort of keep rising, pushing the water level up of mathematical information that is surrounding the problem, mathematical information that looks trivial. And at the end of it, you've trivialized the very specific kernel of the problem. In other words, there's no special piece of information. And the best way to solve a problem is not to assume a really existing special piece of information, but to kind of use it as a useful fiction on the basis of which you generate all the information around it. But your fundamental relationship is that of effectively immersing and or prostrating yourself in the information of reality without taking an absolutely specific, quote, viewpoint on it. And there was another philosopher who thought very similarly, and his name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. And his approach was to extend this basically to language. He didn't know who Grothendieck was, and he died before Grothendieck ever did any mathematics, but there's a sort of theoretical consonance between their ways of thinking. And one of the ways that Wittgenstein approached it was to say, okay, let's say you have something like the color red. And the color red would seem to be something in the world. And you might make a statement like, okay, so red exists. Red is a color like blue. There are, many colors. There's a color spectrum, and obviously you can later develop more and more complex statements on the basis of color. But his entire point was, well, never mind about trying to reason with these kinds of statements about color. The whole point is that color, in some sense, already exists in reality. Therefore, we're reasoning from the existence of red, or even more specifically, we're reasoning from red. When you look at the continuum, for instance, of Wittgenstein's work, from his early to late works, from the Tractatus to the middle works to Investigations, it's a giant attempt to develop a grammar. He's so interested in really the pure idea itself of some underlying structure that is structuring everything. But his solution by Investigations is not to propose a grammar that is structure, that works as a structure. What he's more interested in is showing how, well, our immersion in the details and information of reality is so all-encompassing that you can't reason with specific details. And that, in fact, it's the very presumption of being able to reason with specific details that generates metaphysics, i.e. some other reality that is meant to be really structuring ours, but of course is a pure deformation of reality. We can only fit it into reality to the extent that we can have there's some fantasy that we're going to really see self-identity, you know what I mean? Which of course will never occur. The most you could do in order to include or integrate something like the concept of self-identity would be to treat it like red. Not to reason with it, but to reason from it. And then you would get the kind of position, that one finds, for instance, in the work of Kurt Gödel, where trees and numbers are equally real. They're sort of real in the same way. But there's two very different paradigms again. One where information just exists naively without us, and another version where our immersion in information is so intense that we don't basically know what it means. Meaning itself is a fiction. What we generate are basically languages that are perfectly useful and not actually in a pragmatic sense. In this sense, we should reject any attempts to generate a pragmatic core for Wittgenstein's work and argue instead, no, it's not pragmatism. It's just you don't have any other reference point, which in and of itself destroys the notion of an objective reference point. But rather than throwing you back into a naive pluralism, relativism of viewpoints or informational realities, what you get is the kind of pure demand to have to engage with reality and, to an extent, build up its own fictions as a way of moving through it, but also on this deeper philosophical basis that you're just completely immersed in reality. And the color red is something which already installs your way of thinking. You are already participating in red, and therefore any attempt to try and distinguish what red is either happens completely internally, and therefore, and on that basis, you can't have these kinds of external distinctions unless you have yourself pure external distinctions that you're also, in a sense, kind of reasoning from, rather than just reasoning pragmatically with. And the only illusion in this approach to avoid is what some would call kind of, okay, the pre-givenness then of red, of some material reality, which one finds, for instance, in the work of Heidegger, this obsession with pre-givenness, so that you get what you can characterize as a kind of reflexive phenomenology, which is, okay, well, we have some phenomenon, this much we know, but since we cannot ever fully distinguish it without engaging in all of these reflexive distinctions that will never fully stabilize themselves, there's this constant, for instance, exchange of viewpoints. We're always corrupting any vague notion of objectivity and neutrality. Many people would characterize this as the sort of slow search for truth, but I think one should reject this in that this immersion that I'm describing through Wittgenstein and Grothendieck has nothing to do with something which is pre-given. And here, we have to kind of indulge a critique of Heidegger in order to understand why. In that, an elementary reading, for instance, of Kafka will give you a basic kind of literary description of people who, for instance, do not feel they even exist, whose existence is not simply like an illusion, a sort of an epistemic misunderstanding, a kind of false knowledge, but what some would say is a kind of constitutive illusion, an illusion that kind of works. In other words, it kind of structures their everyday reality. In other words, there's a collapse between this naive distinction of reality versus fiction. And this generates a totally kind of distortionate break with reality. You have people, again, who are sort of entitled to these positions where they say, well, I don't even exist. And I think that one should stand up for these kinds of minimal breaks with reality, rather than trying to gentrify them, reinsert them into, the kind of imminent causality of a reflexive phenomenology. We don't know how it works, but we know nonetheless there is sort of something in front of us that has some functionality. So at the end of this very long argument, I think one could easily reconstruct a theory of AI from all of the pieces that we've been given here. And AI seems to make basically all of the errors that we're trying to avoid. It makes presumptions about the workability and functionality of something. It thinks there is just this naive information there, and certainly AI researchers structure problems on exactly that basis. AI also seems to indulge a notion of metaphysics. Again, whether it's the practitioners intervening and introducing it, or the AI are spontaneously coming upon it themselves, doesn't matter, because what you find is just the need for the substrate of metaphysics. In other words, there's a kind of bad philosophy going on, which I imagine would severely tamper all of the predictions that we have around AI. And so you get a kind of false structure. And you also are thrown back into the philosophical problem of structure. So I'm sure we'll come back, in a sense, to this argument as maybe relatively instructive for, okay, so what reality do we have if not exactly the one we get from AI researchers? But what do you think the next step is in terms of confronting sort of this set of arguments?
towards the end there, I was wondering whether AI for you here is more like a certain idea of AI, or whether you mean more the AI that we currently have. Because I think you're right to say that I could imagine that in both cases, you get this metaphysics that doesn't realize it's doing metaphysics, right? You see it in what ChatGPT says, if you ask ChatGPT to, plan your trip or whatever, or you ask whether this or that is a good idea, and it can kind of give you the reasoning that clearly we as humans seem to think that humans would give. But then also on the side of the idea of AI, yeah, you could also imagine tons of philosophical that don't know their philosophical presuppositions coming in there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that I'm interested in the pure idea of AI, which is, of course, the structuring fiction of all AI research at the moment, which means the extent to which that idea is invested with fantasies, which it absolutely is, will obviously radically overdetermine the possible consequences of the AI research or the AI technology that will be generated. And just to take an example from what you said, I mean, exactly, the answers that we expect to give are our measurement for whether or not AI is succeeding. And therefore, all of the success of AI is, I would argue, kind of pegged to the extent to which we have ourselves a functioning, coherent capacity to reason, or in another sense, a functioning, coherent capacity within our culture of reasoning, practical answers, trip organization, etc.
You made a distinction towards the beginning. I think it was when you brought up Grothendieck, between descriptions of reality on one side and was it reality itself on the other. Yeah, and I think this description is also a very interesting one when we consider that right now, as far as I understand it, the research is such that people see the output that AI gives, but they don't know, as it were, if they were to feed the AI a certain data and then ask a question based on that data, they don't know, as it were, what the implicit theory of the AI would be to explain that data. And I think some people are interested in, if we could zoom in on that, like the way AIs generate theories in the first place, you could get this idea of the scientist AI, which one of the prominent researchers has brought up, where that is precisely what you focus on, kind of theory generation, but explicitly, not just in terms of, not just presupposing or thinking that the AI has some kind of theory just because it gives you a certain output. So it's interesting how already within AI, it's kind of not clear whether AI itself, is supposed to be a description of reality here, or AI itself can also generate one.
Well, there's no question that, AI is just going to confront the same paradoxes that we might find in scientific research, and this will depend then on how reified, objectified, and fantasized upon, say, scientific research already is. And I think in some respects it massively is. If science has reached any deadlocks, I'm certain that artificial intelligence will re-encounter those deadlocks again, especially those deadlocks are not, again, epistemic deadlocks, but kind of real deadlocks where you're confronting certain paradoxes in what is possible to be theorized. For instance, if the basic fantasy of science is to have a total objective account, well, we're thrown back into Grothendieck's problem, which pure mathematicians encounter, which is, well, when we're saying that mathematics or a scientific theory is a model, a representation, a logical representation, we're going to re-encounter the problem of exactly abstraction on the one side as a representation and reality on the other.
I think it's likely that these deadlocks you mentioned in what is possible to be theorized will confront us, the more that we think that we can just build up, as it were, our description of reality on concepts such as self-identity, because, that kind of concept, it precisely tries to get around that deadlock, but somehow without knowing it, or without acknowledging, that such a deadlock could be there in the first place.
Yeah, self-identity as the introduction to metaphysics, the relationship between logic and metaphysics as kind of a necessary support to logic, because we need this other part of reality in order for logical representation to make sense, because we need to have reality. We seem to need self-identity. Otherwise, we're going to have to come up with a very strange approach. Again, either we collapse into pluralization, endlessly colliding viewpoints, no possibility of objectivity, or we save objectivity and the coherence and consistency of reality through introducing a metaphysical variable to really existing objects themselves. The approach is strictly deflationary. I mean, you're right in that they don't believe the deadlock is there, but they've sort of cleverly, in a way, kind of reached around it, insofar as they say, well, this is not a problem that we're actually ever going to have to confront because metaphysics really exists. And an enormous amount of energy in the world of analytic philosophy, at least, has been expended to try and prove now the consistency of a metaphysical world, to show that, and also to further show this relationship between, metaphysics is the missing link in logic. It's also interesting that when you go into AI research, you see tons of different interventions basically of this kind. I think one should basically argue that AI researchers are having to do philosophy. AI also has to do philosophy, which is, far from it being a great enlightened task, is precisely what not invalidates it, because, we're trying to do philosophy right now, but therefore entangles it in the problems of philosophy, which are not, again, about a nice, simple, innocent, objective knowledge, but trying to complicate the questions of knowledge themselves. But again, if you look at, there's many different attempts by AI researchers to have AI spontaneously come up with Newton's law of gravitation, or they try and get AI to come up with really good predictions for, if they're given, billiard balls, they want them to come up with really good models for the interaction of those billiard balls. In fact, the whole point is to get back to this notion of AI sort of doing science, which is maybe a kind of paradigmatic icon as far as, the best of what AI can do. It's not just going to do these menial work tasks. It will do these great intellectual tasks for us. Though I should say, and I hope we get to it later in the podcast, there's an interesting relationship between this intellectual work on the one side and this sort of menial work on the other. But yeah, practical engagements from AI researchers in trying to sort of, what do? They try and figure out how AI can figure out the problem. So they have to kind of go back and re-choose something like Newtonian physics and repackage Newtonian physics through whatever engines or models or neural networks that they're building their AI with, that they're sort of organizing the process of deep learning with. And what that means is that they're having to come up with a really good idea, a really good fiction, I would say, for how Newton discovered gravity. They're not telling a story, but they are doing it by saying, okay, well, if I give AI a bunch of symbols and symbol manipulation, I give them kind of the basic mathematics, and then I also have some way of modeling induction. The hope is, with just these inputs, AI will spontaneously come up, again, with something like a theory of gravitation. And spontaneity is the absolute essential goal here for AI researchers. They want AI to do it on its own. But for me, the paradox, or the kind of the overwhelming presence of fiction, is that it's one thing to introduce the information, the symbols we've used, and theories of induction. I don't think the critique of AI should be, well, we introduced them to this information, they didn't find it themselves. Obviously, the argument of AI researchers is, well, they can find anything we can find. So what we have to evaluate is, what have we ever found? And this is where you get an interesting debate on, well, do we use AI actually, though, to supplement a missing link in our own knowledge? In other words, we have not maybe fully figured out physics, mathematics, logic, metaphysics, pretty much anything. There's some missing link that we're waiting for, which will explain the coherence or prove that our attempts to represent reality are cohesive, make sense. Again, so the project of metaphysics will fulfill itself. We haven't done any of this, so we expect AI to produce this missing link, but I would argue then that AI is basically a pure fiction of the missing link. It allows us to continue fantasizing about how we're about to discover this missing link, in that it allows us to indulge these crazy assumptions about what we have already discovered ourselves. This capacity to represent in all its glory Newton's law of gravitation is the ultimate opportunity for us to say, okay, so now any day now, AI will solve the problem of quantum physics and general relativity. Because we have done sort of enough of the work, now it just has to take on, and it's been simply a question of manpower or intellectual labor as far as the achievement of this research. Or worse yet, we get AI to believe what we really believe, which is that there is this possible objective description of reality. And if you don't believe in that, you're the worst relativist, pluralist, deconstructionist, which I accept is definitely a risk to be avoided. But once again, it's the fantasy of some kind of objective information, some version where I have read or any piece of information or a mathematical problem, and I get to reason with it. I get to sort of just move it around pragmatically, practically, find the combination, and then eventually we'll find the combination that will look like reality and we'll have figured out reality. But of course, I think that the problem is information is meaningless. And the reason why we have fictions in reality in the first place is because we have to intervene on behalf of reality. Not to give it this sort of coherent structure, but to give it basically the structure of coherence itself. Coherence here is a kind of fantasy that allows reality to have a certain degree of cohesion. And what's so interesting when you look at the practice and the kind of concrete interventions of AI research is it is sort of like you are, you know, in the mind of God before he created the world, and you're kind of piecing everything together. And we would like to think that reality is simply a question of bits and pieces that we have to put together. The problem is, what if reality is just meant to appear as a series of bits and pieces, but that this is the kind of user's illusion of reality? It's not really reality itself. Reality actually is fundamentally incoherent, and AI eventually will encounter this incoherence on its own.
Yeah, I think this question of, you know, using AI to sort of supplement our research for first principles is not just relevant for the scientific domain, but also for the, you know, broader domain of society, including how we as a society should choose how to deal with AI, you know, how AI will fit into society. And there, I think we really are faced with the fact that how we pose the problem of how AI fits into society pretty much sets up our answer to it. And I think this holds on several levels. I mean, even looking at the way we train AI, you know, if you train it on the basis of reward functions, on the basis that it has to maximize a certain reward, and then you run into these more theoretical problems about ethics, say, or about, you know, how to control the AI, which is that if I give the AI one goal, how can I know that the goals it might give itself to get to that goal won't conflict with, you know, what we as humanity want, for example? Or how do we ensure that the goals that AI has are consistent with what we want as humans? But this very way, and unfortunately, as I've said, it seems like this is already kind of being embedded into AI, this very, you know, goal, and then you have instruments towards that goal, this very way of thinking is part of the problem. So on the one hand, I think we need to question why we wanted, or, you know, why we ever thought that training AI in this way is a good idea. In that sense, I think the ideas we have about AI and how it should be and how it might work just reflect certainly insights we've had about, you know, human learning and all of that, but it also is a great deal of fiction, as you said. And then on the other hand, now that we're in this position that we are building these AI systems, yeah, the question is, how do we deal with the question of how AI will fit into society while keeping in mind that this is not just an empirical question, this is very much a question of first principles. And what I mean by that it's not an empirical question is that you see people saying, that it's just a matter of getting the risk right. It's just a matter of being right on the question of whether advanced AI will be able to kill us or will want to kill us or not. And advanced AI can here either be human level AI or so-called artificial superintelligence, which is AI that's conceived to be smarter than humans. I don't think it's a question of predicting these risks correctly. I don't think that will help us answer any of the important questions here. And I think that it's one instance where we see that conditions that we already face as humans, how should we organize our societies? How should we run things? I think with AI, we kind of turn them into this external problem where suddenly there are these huge stakes because we could see things going so wrong. And we don't even face, we don't even think about, okay, what is even our baseline that we're comparing it to? What are ways we could improve that? So it gets this external nature to it that I don't think is true to the nature of the problem.
Well, it's not true to nature, maybe. I mean, introducing ethics as if this is the only problem with AI, all else is functional, it's simply a question of constraining its goals, as you were hinting at, seems to miss the fact that AI already might not work with respect to nature any more than we do. It's not about critiquing AI in defense of, oh, look how capable we are, how intelligent we are, but more deconstructing the concept of intelligence or consciousness, if you like, which is at work here. Even presumptions we make about it, consciousness, I think we should doubt. For the very same reason that a Kafka character might find him or herself doubting. And this doubt, again, if you imagine it as an ethical problem, is not simply a sort of balancing risk question. There are forms of doubt that are so all-encompassing and corrosive that they distort the very metrics that we use to measure doubt. And in fact, one can sort of pretty easily introduce a bunch of reflexive paradoxes that just sort of, I would say, denature AI, make AI, produce serious challenges for AI. I mean, one weird example is sort of a very intuitive example for a human being and gets at the problem of embodiment for AI. But if my tongue hurts, it's difficult to say what is in pain if I'm using my tongue to figure out where the pain is. Right? The pain, if it's on the back of my tongue or even the tip of my tongue, the very thing, again, I'm using to figure out what is in pain itself. I have the sensation of pain, but the metrics of my pain are I wouldn't even say corrupted. The irony is this is a perfectly natural occurrence, a perfectly kind of embodied occurrence. But what's interesting here is that can you expand this to the whole of reality? Are there situations in, let's call it absolute reality, where my tongue hurts and I'm using my tongue to figure out what's going on? I mean, in such a situation, it's the same as with representations on the one side and reality on the other. If my representations are infected, in pain, if in any way they're, again, we use, and it matters which metrics we use to define this, if they're biased, if there's something non-spontaneous, then we might say that, the version of reality we're getting is wrong. But in absolute reality, you have to go a step further and say, oh, but it's not just that my picture of reality is wrong. There are situations where the problems that occur in representation are also problems in reality. In fact, the distinction collapses between the two. And representation either, again, doesn't work because we still haven't figured out a coherent enough version of representation, or representation does have a role in structuring a reality that is kind of fundamentally incoherent. Another good example of a nice reflexive paradox is something that comes, if anyone who's read the Brothers Karamazov will be familiar with this strange story that they tell of this saint who is martyred, who gets his head cut off, and the miracle is that he's still alive, right, in the sort of nice form of Christian wonders and miracles, and then picks up his head and kisses it. A pure reflexive paradox, if ever there was one. But there are at least two levels here. Not only is there, well, what is the status of a miracle in reality, right? The miracle is the opposite antithesis of natural reality. Well, in a purely kind of Wittgensteinian sort of reasoning from as opposed to reasoning with way, we would be more inclined to read all of reality against the miracle rather than the miracle against reality. In other words, the miracle is much more instructive because it destabilizes our very accounts of coherence themselves, which so far have structured our impression of how reality kind of naively causally functions. But another level at which it works is, again, it is this kind of, how could AI solve this kind of problem? Obviously it matters how you stage the problem. Is it a linguistic problem? Is it a kind of puzzle? Is it a situation that an embodied AI might find itself in? Well, this is where all of our own assessments of AI hang. The extent to which we even think that AI can encounter this problem is important. Rather than supposing what AI won't be able to capture is, our human gestures and our sense of human grace, or the capacity to express mercy. All of these things are, I think, deeply important problems. But one maybe should imagine these really unintelligent problems that are not stupid as such, but a kind of negation of intelligence, a kind of unintelligent in that it's like they're not coherent, but in their very incoherence, they pose a problem with respect to the naive assumption of the functionality of reality. And there's just no question that reality is going to have, that AI rather, is going to have to encounter these problems, not, as you were saying, as things which it can kind of gentrify, quantify, or locate somewhere else in some naive secular context, a kind of risk-reward problem or a sort of naive ethical problem, but problems within reality itself. Again, not simple limits that we could imagine overcoming one day. But again, the whole point here is that fiction does have a role in helping to structure reality. But therefore, again, when you look at all these concrete examples of getting AI to learn physics, what you see is the broader project of trying to prove that our fictions exist. That's more what we're engaged in doing with AI. It has less to proving that, concrete reality exists, because we don't even know if reality is concrete or whether it exists or not. And that is, without question, the only real philosophical problem or proper philosophical challenge. And no, we're not even there yet. All we're sort of doing at the moment is trying to get AI to sort of validate our fictions, which re-entangles us with the problem that all of science, mathematics, logic are fictions whose purpose is to try and structure, for instance, the fantasy of the missing link of objective knowledge, which by definition of the problem we won't necessarily ever reach.
I mean, it seems like some of the problems that we want AI to become involved in are problems of the kind that you just talked about, where it's not a problem to be solved somehow. It's not, give me the correct way of viewing this or something of the person whose head is cut off and then they kiss their own head. Like it's more, of a problem that's of a kind that maybe won't go away. Perhaps one could put it like that. And in that sense, it's also, I think, not useful to try and imbue some kind of epistemic humility, say, into AI, where we get back to this paradigm of AI can generate theories, and then, and the concern might be, but if the AI just relies on a single theory that could explain all the given data, then that's not good because it would have to evaluate the other theories too, or something like this. And there's this idea that somehow AI, to be truly useful to us, should be able to know its own limits. I mean, this is a phrase I really saw on a blog by a prominent researcher on AI. And this gets at how even if AI doesn't, you talked about consciousness before, but even if AI doesn't exhibit consciousness as such, it still might be caught up. It's almost like if AI, the idea is that AI could be more useful to us if it somehow got involved in these problems that we have. But if some of them are just such that for us they won't go away, even if AI joins us in these problems, say, right, then we can't have this more naive notion that AI can really help us solve problems. And if it turns out that AI can't join us in thinking about these things, then we're just kind of left alone, and we're thrown back into the question as we kind of were before. It's just that now we don't have the fiction of AI or a superhuman intelligence to cling to that could solve this for us.
Now that we've sort of deconstructed the problem of AI to some extent, the question is there an alternative? You know, a political alternative, but maybe a philosophical alternative to AI? Is it simply a question of abandoning the project totally? Are there sort of better ways of structuring the investigation of AI? Maybe the test is, again, will AI, say, ever do philosophy? Will AI ever sort of come upon sort of radical Cartesian doubts? Or if you take the opinion of some philosophers, it's actually certainty that is really difficult. You know, doubt is not the first position. Certainty is the more immediate position, and therefore the more difficult position, I would argue. So what would it mean for AI to have certainty? And I think the purpose of the first half of our discussion was to sort of suggest in what sense, well, all of our paradigms of certainty are wrong. They're based upon a fiction of objectivity. They're based upon a metaphysics of that objectivity, right, which need each other. And on top of that, we seem to be using AI to sort of pass off the project of human reason, even though because we seem to have failed to do much about it ourselves. And it materially allows us to continue fantasizing in a certain way about the missing link of reason, without necessarily ever having to come up with the goods. And one really interesting way of thinking about this is talking about a piece of intelligence that, of course, we're all blessed with, which is our brain. And our brain sort of maybe is not getting a fair enough defense in many discussions of AI. I think we assume such strange things about the human being and the brain that it's left to the wayside, that the brain is probably the most extraordinary piece of technology, and if it is the most extraordinary organism. And I want to make the argument again through the brain now that we should imagine the brain as a kind of good fiction itself. It's not different from AI. It's a structure that is attempting to introduce distinctions and reflexively organize those distinctions. In that sense, the most that we can hope for with AI and the brain is the same thing, that the brain will come upon basically philosophical problems. One interesting distinction that we can introduce is that, when you have a pure reflexive process of problem solving, such as that's even possible, without, crazy Christian and Kafkaesque paradoxes, I think that maybe one leg up that the brain has, as opposed to a process of pure reflexive reasoning, is that the brain has these kinds of materialized structures, these repeatable structures. In other words, it has given over however millions of years certain answers to reality. It's introduced certain fictions of certainty. Causality is a very good example, but once you get into the brain, you can break down many different complexities in terms of the ingrained, sort of concrete, materialized philosophical answers that it has given. What the brain can never do, though, is get rid of the irreducible question of reflexive questioning, reflexive processing itself. But obviously, the best living researcher of the brain right now, Ian McGilchrist, who talks about hemisphere theory, already has this weird mystery that he has to somehow deconstruct, where the brain has an asymmetry. It's not that we have certain things that the left hemisphere does and certain things that the right hemisphere does. We literally have two different ways of processing the same kind of information, two different ways of processing time, two different ways of processing emotion, two different ways of processing language. And even if, the left hemisphere, say, might take the majority of language and the right hemisphere is kind of nonverbal, they still have higher order, their own precise and specific ways of processing whatever they're being given to encounter. And in some sense, this also asks the question again of, does AI need a body? Does AI therefore need a capacity to kind of concretize a certain degree of materiality? Obviously, at the moment, that's a mixture of math and engineering right now. It's sort of neural networks and also, sort of graphic engines, all these attempts to sort of simulate reality. But one should maintain that distinction. These are simulations of reality, which we're trying to use to further simulate reality. It's not just that they're really good guesses of reality. Rather, like the brain, they're again, philosophical answers to reality that are not imperfect because they're epistemically imperfect, but they're sort of really good fictions again. And if we go off of the initial introduction of this question of immersion, of being immersed in reality, they're not just useful fictions. They're kind of things to some extent which are kind of there, not in a pre-given way, but we just don't have a concept of meaningful information. All we have is kind of pure information, and what fictions do is they introduce some difference into that information. But the difference is not structured on the basis of another piece of information. The difference is like, a pure decision, say, to take up a particular piece of information and treat it as if it's something exceptional or special. And this is all the brain does. The brain, not insignificantly, reinforces the reality that it finds. And McGilchrist is obsessed with this, that there is co-creation. But rather than imagining co-creation as some kind of mystical process where we're creating reality literally, imagine it as a process where the brain has certain guesses, certain ways of structuring information that has no inner meaning. In other words, maybe the ultimate position of the brain would be that of Grothendieck's sort of chestnut, right? An act of pure prostration. Almost one can imagine it's a monastic position, a position of pure faith. That would maybe be its sort of originary position, but then it does act in certain ways with respect to difference. It does sort of introduce almost certain theological dimensions, not unlike Christianity. You get sort of the question of love, which some philosophers describe as precisely raising something to this exceptional status. The object of love, and the brain might undergo a certain thing, and it might sort of quote unquote fall in love with causality or with time, and then our brain does structure the fiction of reality. And what that means is that reality is a fiction. We don't have fiction on one side and reality on another. What we have is a fiction, which is called reality. And it doesn't make reality fake. It means that the basic ethical project of reality is that of arranging fictions, in view, though, of the fact that we're immersed in it purely, with the problem of reflexivity. In other words, there is no piece of information that is sort of more guaranteed than another. There's just, again, the kind of problem of pure information. And so to my mind, and this is sort of to introduce a certain thesis, I think that what we should be doing is less building AI than, if anything, fully turning the problem on its head and building a world for the brain. Ostensibly, we've already done this, you would think. We've had no choice. But there's always been the supplement of other pieces of technology. But here we shouldn't see technology as some kind of alienated medium or substance as against our perfectly romantically included brain or humanity, and rather see that these are just slightly better fictions. Our brain is an even better piece of technology. In fact, it's such a good piece of technology that it forces us to collapse the distinction between reality on the one hand and alienated reality, which we're inclined to call technology, right? This kind of lifeless, passive reality. And so that seems to me to be the more interesting project. And what might be interested if we could sort of explore what the consequences of building the world for the brain would look like and actually be, and why this is such a critical answer, obviously, to AI itself and the radical fantasies that it invests us in. Again, to introduce an important point, the fantasies of AI are maybe particularly dangerous because unlike these fictions which we consent to create, these are fictions we don't think are fictions. In other words, they're unconscious. And we don't therefore accept the irreducible and sort of kind of dangerous, as it were, freedom that comes along with the creation of fictions. We imagine, again, that we're really leading somewhere, that a certain accumulation of structure will eventually result in some total viewpoint, and we can move away from the question of having to make a decision for ourselves or having to introduce the variable of faith. So before maybe we get to teasing at some of those consequences, what do you make of this idea of building a world for the brain?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about when you mentioned the brain's original position so to speak, from which it then, as you said, say it falls in love with causality. I wonder if you could maybe expand on that.
Well, it's the problem of reflexivity. It's the problem that even before we get the brain, we already sort of have the brain. And there are two different ways of thinking about this. One, you get the question of immersion, Grothendiekian or Wittgensteinian immersion, which again is not this pre-given mystical immersion, where we already know everything, or in the case of, say, Platonic philosophy, a theory of knowledge as remembrance, so we're just remembering what we already know because the truth, we're already included in the truth, so knowledge itself is remembrance. Against these paradigms, Wittgensteinian or Grothendiekian immersion is more about, again, the fact that we sort of already have something, like a brain, say, if it's a question of material reality. And what we try to conclude when we engage in the questions of meaning or philosophical investigation or logical investigation is to arrive at some piece of meaning that will tell us what it means. But the obvious Wittgensteinian point is, well, we actually kind of, not that we already know what it means, but we're already implicated in the question of meaning already. We already have a kind of understanding. And therefore, the move is to sort of engage in some process of acceptance, insofar as we basically don't understand what we understand. That's the kind of paradox we have to live with. There's a nice line from philosopher Slavoj Žižek when he says, in the philosophy of Hegel, the movement from understanding to reason, which in German idealism is this sort of paradigmatic movement from a set of knowledge to the actual activity itself of this spirit called reason, the not just, in other words, epistemic distinctions, but the genuine engine of reality as a rational entity itself, again, what Hegel calls spirit. Zizek's brilliant point is you don't get at that, you don't move from understanding to reason by finding that, again, what we've called the missing link, the radical sort of total objective view where there will be, again, paradoxically, some piece of information that is more important than the others that will nonetheless appear purely objectively. I think that's a pretty good description of totalitarianism, a kind of imposed exception, as opposed to, say, like a pure Christian emancipatory view would be, no, you choose the exceptional piece of information that will define the meaning of your life. But Zizek's point is that the movement from understanding to reason actually happens with a subtraction, not an addition, in that understanding simply subtracts the fantasy of reason. And then you get understanding that now is a kind of, and this is the paradox, right? Now you get understanding as a pure missing link. In other words, you sort of just get the material without the nice structuring fantasy of the missing link. You get a kind of unfinished material reality. And this introduces the other side of the problem of reflexivity, the other way to approach it, as opposed to immersion, which is back to these weird Kafkaesque or Christian sort of paradoxical materialities of, the tongue that doesn't know where its pain is because it's in pain, or the head that gets cut off, which then kisses itself. Again, it's interesting that even the way that one can gentrify that is to say it kisses itself, i.e. the metaphysical solution is to introduce identity so as to avoid the possibility of incoherence. But I think that incoherence actually exists in reality, and this is the paradox we have to take seriously. And so the problem of pure reflexivity is actually, okay, do we have these kinds of reflexive paradoxes? Do we have a body that gets its head cut off and all naive causality is abandoned? And the reason why this is a sort of reflexive problem is because it's sort of like, well, how does anything get started then? How does any distinction in reality begin? Such that you have kind of, the basics of material identity. And the point is, where you don't get it, just as the movement from understanding to reason works, you subtract the naive question of identity, and then you get this kind of raw, unfinished, incoherent materiality. And then the project of reason, insofar as it's reinstalled, is to figure out how do we live with a reality that has basically not just this incoherence in it, but the problem that every distinction I set up, I have to forcibly set up. Again, this is the only real definition of fiction, something which I choose to set up, i.e. it's not real, and yet it's completely necessary to reality that I set it up. But I have to take complete responsibility for that, and therefore reality is already entangled with an ethical project. So that would be a description of, if we're going to imagine something like a brain, an originary position, which is not really an originary position, would just be the sort of weird Cartesian position we already find ourselves in. And this would be an example of what the brain has to overcome, has to give an answer to. So obviously the brain has a really good concept of immersion. There's tons of different descriptions of how the brain deals with immersion. It also has a really good process for reflexive fictions. You know, obviously describing this in detail would take some time, but there's no question that the brain basically, in order to get started, has to engage with these paradoxes, which is also why it's a fiction as well. It's only so good as the extent to which it can kind of bootstrap the ethical problem of reality. In other words, the brain doesn't overcome this problem. It just, if anything, the brain just kind of introduces this problem as something to be dealt with, and then comes up with an answer for it, which highlights what you said earlier already, which is that, well, obviously the introduction of the problem is the only problem, right? The very way that I stage reality is the only thing at stake here. And therefore, you know, an elementary description of the brain would be some device or technology or again, fiction that structures the problem of reality. You know, that's all the brain is. It is the technology that we have, which fictionalizes and therefore structures the problem of reality.
I wanted to get back to what it would mean to build a world for the brain. As you said, in some sense, it could be said that we've already done that. And there I want to refer to McGilchrist's, you know, broad cultural, societal critique of our times, which is that our world, as it now largely exists in most parts of the world, is essentially a world built for the left hemisphere, built as the left hemisphere of the brain sees the world. And so the left hemisphere for McGilchrist is this hemisphere that in right-handed people is connected to the right hand. So it's really concerned with grasping things. And this is not just a metaphor. You know, you can also see this in other animals who also have two different strands of nervous systems. And this grasping extends to a certain way of abstracting things, of decontextualizing, of, you know, seeing things like, or concepts rather, like morality and beauty as add-ons sort of to our description of the world rather than already embedded in the world. This extends to, you know, analyzing processes and wholes into their parts, into, you know, made up somehow of these bits that we also talked of earlier, that now, you know, we think AI can just study and then make up or understand all of reality from these bits. This is precisely also a left hemisphere understanding at work there. So clearly, you know, when we say we want to build a world for the brain, that does not necessarily get us there as a phrase, right? Because the brain in itself, as you pointed out too, has this asymmetry.
Obviously, though, the movement from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, so to speak, duplicates the movement from understanding to reason in a rather interesting way. From sort of pure grasping, pure abstraction, decontextualization, towards, okay, this cohesive, wholesome, rational view, which therefore means we should probably make use of the same Zizek'ian operation then to the movement between the hemispheres. What you get when you move to the right hemisphere is not an add-on, but in a sense, a subtraction of the delusions of the left hemisphere. And in fact, since we're discussing McGilchrist now, McGilchrist does talk extensively about how delusional the left hemisphere is. It's the most associated with, alongside this context of grasping and abstraction, which literally relates to the grasping of the hand. There's a relationship between the physicality of the hand and the cognitive processes of the left hemisphere. There's also associations with anger. The left hemisphere is the only emotion it has is anger, right? Because what is anger? Well, it's grasping, it's fixing, it's controlling, and it's the most delusional. It's the most interested in itself. And this is effectively observable in the fact that the left hemisphere doesn't care what the right hemisphere is doing. Literally, if you can imagine that. One side of the brain doesn't care what the other side is doing. Of course, they have to do this thing called fine-tuning. They have to work together. You get the unbelievable fine grasping followed by the generality of the right hemisphere. But the question again is, to address your problem with this phrase, building a world for the brain, is it a question of building a more right hemisphere world by introducing more context, introducing more worldliness? Well, if we try and do this, generally this happens with structures of political society. We try and sort of have a bigger world, or, greater freedoms, greater forms of participation. Obviously not necessarily the world that AI is creating, but I also think that we shouldn't necessarily think of it as an additive, but that the movement from a left hemisphere world to a right hemisphere world, insofar as McGilchrist argues, this asymmetry is actually crucial. They work together, but the right hemisphere is more important. We have to think about what would it mean not to supplement abstraction with something more real. We get back to the original problem from earlier in the conversation, but actually trying to figure out in what sense reality is just a better representation, a better fiction, more engaged with the pure question of simulation. And in that sense, you can understand the right hemisphere's radical creativity, right? It doesn't just have context, it creates context. That's a good description of what the special thing is of the right hemisphere. In other words, the right hemisphere is understanding that doesn't have the illusion of rationality, and therefore has to work with what is in front of it and treat the illusion of rationality as an illusion, but a very helpful illusion, a helpful fiction. So maybe to sort of stage this in terms of like, okay, what then would this world possibly look like? What is the alternative to simply naively continuing to develop progressively AI research? And I think it might be helpful to think about some things that we do, many of which are sort of pre-digital, but have been supplemented by other technologies, of course. I'll use an interesting phrase. When you don't know the weather for next week, what do? Right? We live in a sort of instant society. And what that means is that we need to know it instantly. And the pitfall of that is that all of our commercial, global, political processes rely upon that instant information. And if we don't know the weather for next week, we can't make decisions. Obviously, a farmer 300 years ago who had to refer to his almanac and look at the position of the stars and look at the moisture in the earth in front of him or her would have to make a deep decision. And that decision, however, we shouldn't imagine as just a process, say, of, really good contextualized understanding, or again, as just knowledge of some sense. What's amazing is that the farmer has to encounter reality effectively as something that has been staged for his or her interaction. It is also a fiction, and it sort of has, a certain degree of water, a certain degree of moisture, humidity, and then they kind of try and introduce some context to this piece of information. In other words, the extent to which we can engage people in introducing context as a creative process is a very good example and definition of what participation, engagement, decision-making really mean. And what's amazing, again, is that the brain already massively does this. What are we trying to accelerate with AI? What are we trying to do quicker with AI? What are the tasks, labor tasks, which of course involve extraordinary fantasies about what commercial society is about as well, about what our markets are about as well. In other words, this is not a reality that is accidentally there. It's one that we continue to reinstall daily through our participation. And so how to generate a context, how to generate a society in which contextualization is a free decision. How do you introduce creativity into reality, and how do you support the fact that the brain already does this? And so trying to do things quicker as if there's something we're missing when we already have a brain. And again, not a brain that we understand, not a brain that already works, a brain that itself is just a machine for coming up with theories about reality. Why do we need then an AI as a scientific practitioner when we already have the brain? And you can basically, go through many of the sort of the decision-making matrices of how we do things in reality and ask yourself, okay, are we invited to make a decision? Well, how do we conceive of a decision right now? A decision is an interruption. A decision is a slowdown. If I don't have to make the decision, it's better. I think the opposite is true. I think that decisions are vital for the very engagement that constructs the context in which information is given any form of sense, any form of meaning. If you destabilize contextualization, then you do not have meaning. And the information is just a sort of pure information. We always have to introduce decision making. Therefore, we have to have participation. We have to have engagement. Obviously, a deep political problem is on what basis? What are the contexts going to be? And this is a problem we don't necessarily have, but what we have to respect is the link between the fact that if we make fewer and fewer decisions, there are going to be fewer and fewer decisions to make, there are going to be fewer and fewer guarantees, and then there's going to literally be less and less meaning in reality. Ironically, less technology in reality. In some respects, we're a less technological society than older societies. Their technologies were just more diverse, more dispersed. Being able to, technology is everything. There's this constant movement between reality as an active process versus reality as a passive process. And rather than trying to sort of figure out which is which, we should collapse the distinction and recognize in what sense, even the humidity levels in the atmosphere are a technology that reality installs in order to support the fiction that reality really exists.
Yeah, right. I think it's interesting that I think in some sense, people who worry about AI risk, they try to turn this condition that what you've described, that what if we don't know next week's weather, right, which has been our condition for most of humanity's existence, they try to turn that into the ultimate horizon for any decision we must make right now, rather than facing that this has been our horizon all along. It's suddenly meant to, again, as you said, take the decision away, right? It's supposed to tell us there isn't a real decision because these are the risks and so on. These are our predictions and the unimaginable harm that could occur and so on. I think, again, like even, this horizon of we don't know what the weather next week will be, perhaps we should add that this horizon would apply to AI itself too, and that, even if we assume that, okay, AI will also have to preserve itself like we do, never mind the fact that we have preserved ourselves through these very contextual structures, as you've pointed out. I think we need to see that even for AI, probably there won't be an obvious way to preserve itself, if that notion even makes sense when we apply it to AI. I don't know if it ever will, but where AI also, so to speak, will have to make a decision. And again, we face, I think, that there is no horizon that will take that decision away from you, whether it's us or whether it's AI.
Well, the horizons are themselves a decision. Horizons are fictions, right? The moment we don't have the fiction of humidity of the atmosphere, you don't have the horizon anymore. It disappears. And that's the only good definition we should have of material reality. Like, it's the process by which we introduce fictions and install them. And so, AI won't necessarily, we can't make decisions increasingly. And because there are fewer and fewer processes for decision making. And what the interesting link that we're observing here is that the weather itself will change the moment you do not have some context where you're participating in the weather. To be blunt, we're literally seeing this with climate change, in that we can affect the very context of nature. Nature is not just here. Nature is like the brain, a giant, unbelievably structured fiction, whose horizons can be disabled, dismantled. Absolutely. And everything can be different, right? The process of pure reflexivity takes over, and no distinctions anymore like the weather or good natural or ecological causality can be installed. This has to be the kind of zero level by which we approach the problem. And so what that means is that we're responsible for installing these horizons, and they're not just there as problems to be solved, so that once we get rid of them, we'll have, again, this metaphysics. We'll have this other world of pure efficiency, which, of course, nobody tells you is the ultimate fiction, structuring our obsessive search for pure representation, a representation that will just work, that will be better than all the other information, as opposed to just this pure material information which we have to choose to engage with, and the very fact that reality itself is not just already set up for us. And so I think that that link between the weather changing is basically the stakes here for creating any world, whether it's with AI or not. There's nothing particularly special about AI as far as I can see. Oh, it can do everything for us. I'm certain of it, because we're not necessarily very special either. But what we'll lose increasingly is these dynamics of participation themselves, which do create the weather. The way that we interact through agriculture, through all these human systems and human technologies, they're vital processes to literally like maintaining the context in which reality exists and makes sense. Otherwise we will be thrown back into, probably the purest brain society is one where there was so little technology except the technology of natural reality. The hunters and gatherers who were pure brain societies. In this sense, one isn't necessarily trying to go towards a society where only the brain is emphasized, but where the brain has things with which it can interact, where the decision-making process of the brain continues into reality. That's what one should get interested in, and we should try and structure reality such that the decision-making process continues. And to give a really good example of this, and it's also an interesting problem in mathematics that embodies the problems that we see already throughout this search for representation. And he basically discovered, no, you can't actually go across all 7 without crossing one of the others. The point is he developed something called graph theory, the beginnings of graph theory, in order to figure out the problem. In other words, he took the problem of the bridges, turned it into a different kind of
There was a problem that the
a
mathematician
different piece
Euler
of
discovered,
information.
which he called the 7
And he turned it
bridges
into a
of
graph.
Königsberg.
And then once he saw the graph,
He
it was
wanted to
easy
figure out whether you
solve.
could walk
The problem was
through the
trivial.
city
Was
and
this
cross
not a
each
good
of those
example of
bridges
Grothendieck'ian
once and only once.
chestnut thinking? In this sense, I am all in favor of representation if we treat it as another fiction, which allows us to see the same problem from the other side. All nature is a process whereby we have basically different representations. And we don't get re-engaged in some pluralism, where, there's sort of no morality and any perspective goes. No, this is not what emerges from this at all. Instead, what one gets is, on the contrary, a kind of, the representation matters so long as we don't think of it as somehow more true than the other piece of information. The bridges are also like a piece of mathematics. If you go back, engineering structured them. They're a totally reified piece of technology. It's not like bridges are more natural than graph theory. No, I disagree with this entirely. Nor should we say graph theory is more natural than bridges, though. This, of course, is the illusion of AI. Of course, we get from graph theory the illusion of hidden layers. And people may or may not know this, but graph theory was used to design Google. Graph theory was used to create the algorithm for the sort of the versions of Google. Something called PageRank or something was the first thing that was designed by the designers of and engineers of Google. And in other words, they had to figure out from a piece of a bunch of empirical data sets, like different pages, and how to rank them. It was called PageRank. And you would want to turn it into a graph, because then a graph was simpler. But sometimes, as we're seeing, simplicity is not always the most efficient. Sometimes, actually, for instance, our relationship through, the Farmer's Almanac is a better relationship with the weather. Because sometimes knowing what the weather is going to be every minute of every day makes it impossible for me to make a decision, because my decision is constantly subject to change. And this is not a problem you can just solve, right? Calculus is not going to help you figure it out, because if the information you're generating collapses the decision-making matrix, then the problem doesn't exist anymore. In other words, speeding up the information will dissolve the very context in which the information exists. And so what the 7 bridges of Königsberg introduces is 2 different pieces of information that kind of work together. And depending on what version of society you want, you privilege one or the other, or again, you privilege both. The beauty of, Swiss mathematics in the 18th century, Euler's world, is you had bridges and mathematics, and you did them side by side, and how interesting was that? And the only response really to the 7 bridges of Königsberg is not just to say, okay, can we get a graph from this? But, okay, what am I doing with these bridges? Oh, okay, I go across one to go to the pub or something. Like, what is the... In this case, we should emphasize the naive life world of the bridges of Königsberg, not to get at something more real than graph theory, but on the contrary, to understand the technology of bridges. So that when we go to build our society, we say, okay, do we want bridges or do we want graph theory? Well, we want bridges when we're interested in going to the pub, because the pub is important for discussion and human exchange, as moisture in the soil is important for the farmer determining the next week's weather. And when do we want graph theory? Well, when we need really abstract representations, when simplicity of an informational kind is important. But graph theory is also a decision. The best mathematics involves really good decision making. If you return to Grothendieck's paradigm, his interest was to reintroduce decision making back into mathematics. If you wanted to choose between different viewpoints, his point was not just to say, okay, which viewpoint kind of works best, but to try and figure out what is the purest relationship that we can have to reality, such that, one, we can actually discover viewpoints in reality. In other words, Grothendieck would have loved the idea of two different versions of the seven bridges of Königsberg, the bridges themselves and the graph theory. And he would have been very interested in saying, okay, so in what respect does mathematics deal with these kinds of problems? Well, we introduce mathematics, on the one hand, as a pragmatic, practical solution to certain problems, or on the other hand, we introduce mathematics as a decision-making matrix in and of itself, not unlike the brain or nature. In other words, it has certain ways of thinking about reality that are really important. And probably the most important thing that Grothendieck discovered was that, well, maybe eventually we have to stop doing mathematics. Eventually, turning a problem into mathematics will not be helpful, because eventually you're going to have to prostrate yourself, immerse yourself fully within the problem, and you're going to have to decide what it means to you. And there is no pure mathematical solution. There is just a decision. And we should basically build a world, I would think, that reflects this. And we should absolutely have a robust relationship to natural reality, to existing material realities, especially when they take billions of years to create. AI is not going to displace those material realities, let alone the task of organizing them, which is the task of society.
This example of the bridges is really beautiful because, as you've shown, it really makes us see this connection that more abstract thinking like mathematics can have to reality. Of course, what we're seeing a lot of nowadays is sort of, it's not just that abstract thinking is done sort of for its own sake, but it's also almost that abstract thinking is over and over and over applied to itself in the hopes that, I guess, the best version of that would be we're going to somehow approximate reality with that, right? We're going to improve on our abstract thinking with even more and more abstract procedures to blow the life back into it. So, of course, that's not really how that works. And, even with AI, as we've already also now spoken about, we see this structure of throwing even more intervention of that kind, onto the societal, quote-unquote, problems we have. And I think the best version, though, of AI, and you've hinted at this before too, is that AI could help us see problems sort of from the other side. But I just don't think right now we're building it that way, unfortunately.
And I'm not sure if it's entirely possible. I mean, AI can definitely do everything we can do. It can do mathematics, probably. Maybe eventually it'll be able to do it. And what it won't be able to do necessarily is make a decision. And this is kind of the sort of pure gap, or it won't necessarily be able to handle the fact that, there's these kind of unconscious dimensions to reality, which are not just things we don't know, but like, for instance, the fact itself that reality needs a fiction, that reality is a fiction, that you need these supportive fictions for reality to have coherence. It's not that reality is coherent and then it proceeds towards incoherence. I think reality is kind of incoherent and it's endlessly supplementing itself with coherence. And this coherence, therefore, always has a certain shelf life. And, the process that takes up the expiry dates of our fictions is called politics, because we have to make another decision. And definitely, I think if we took upon AI as another, okay, this is a crazy materiality that we have, like natural reality, nature, the brain, the weather, mathematics, maybe we could do it in a similar way. it seems, as you pointed out already, like abstraction upon abstraction. It's pure ideology. I'm not sure what it supplements as a fiction. I'm not even sure what the kind of naive, exceptional piece of information that AI is trying to privilege. You know what I mean? I mean, the description here is literally that something like nature chooses trees, or nature chooses causality. It literally privileges these kinds of paradigms. And so it's a struggle for me to imagine what exactly AI is privileging. And the only answer I can think of, and this is not a good answer, is that of course it supplements the present collapsing state of market society. And this is where we see this relationship between intellectual labor and actual kind of menial labor, is that AI is engaged massively in trying to do an enormous amount of work that we can't afford to do anymore. You know, we haven't theorized the internet very well. It was an extraordinary explosion of freedom, and then we didn't really figure it out. And the tech companies instead became much more interested in speculative valuations on the stock market. To me, it's not an accident that the 2008 financial crisis happened, 5 years after Facebook began. It's because, well, the mentality shift that should have happened in the 2008 financial crisis was, okay, well, maybe we don't need financial descriptions of human work or human process. What we need now are internet descriptions, a better fiction, in short. But we've remained so cripplingly tied to the financial system, which has only really been around in its present form since the 1970s. Though if you really want to be historical, you have to go back 500 years and look at the beginning of capitalism and modern banking. But we're using AI to compensate for the fact that we can't afford society anymore. Why can we not afford society? Because we're not making decisions anymore. Society literally is losing wealth because it's losing participation. Participation generates wealth. It generates wealth in our soil. It generates wealth in our climate. It generates wealth in our universities. It generates wealth in our societies in general. It generates decision-making, and out of those decision-making come literally materialities of a certain richness. Remember, if you are looking up the weather instantly, trust me, the weather will start to change. The weather will become less a weather built up on the basis of humidity and humidity levels and sort of, certain natural features of this really good fiction that we have called the weather, and will become totally dysphoric. And look at the way that we'll continue to pursue rampant industrialization and commercialization without thinking about the impacts of it. Look at the huge energy cost of AI data farms. In other words, pursuing AI will directly lead to changes in the weather. It's not a kind of accidental relationship, because it's about this embedded relationship of decision-making and materiality. And so we're either going to take responsibility for that and see in what respect political society right now is not introducing really meaningful decision-making, but trying to patch up as quickly as possible what's the barest version of society we can have without chaos, without everything collapsing and breaking down. And AI is basically this sort of flippant tool to sort of continue doing things without having to figure out how to have wages in a post-welfare society, or how to have a finance system in a post-finance society, or more importantly, how to have the internet. This explosive freedom without the corruption and control of big tech companies. AI is about synthesizing decision-making in the worst sense, not really having decision-making. And what we need to get back is decision-making. And we need to recognize this link between decision-making and materiality in order to do so. And maybe to get back to the very beginning of this question of building a world for the brain, well, this is how you build a world for the brain. You re-engage all the good paradigms of decision-making and their links to material realities. And AI, as a pure ideology, just literally is not designed to have an answer for this question. Its status is as a pure fiction, to help us create fictions without really creating fictions. It's the worst imitation, in a sense, of material reality, and also, of course, human decision-making on the other side as well. So, in my opinion, building a politics then that responds, or a philosophy that responds to AI, is like one of trying to focus on what not so innocent problem has AI emerged to address. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It came at precisely the moment when so much of our decision-making had broken down, that we needed to remove the very stage or context of decision-making itself, which is the only kind of apocalyptic materiality that AI introduces. It introduces the possibility of a world without decisions, which eventually will be a world that, as far as I'm concerned, materially just exists only at the most deprived and depraved level.
I think what this all has confronted us with is that we can't just offload doing philosophy, thinking about how we want the future of the world to go, to a couple of AI researchers.
Nor can we leave it to AI itself. I mean, AI is doing philosophy. It's like literally also piecing together reality. We have to recognize that this might actually, weirdly enough, be our task. In other words, rather than trying to get AI to do our task, we have to do the tasks which we've currently given to AI.